This is everything that you need to know to swap in an 05 and up Super Duty front axle into your OBS Ford. Whenever you strip that Super Duty axle, take as much of it as you can. Like if you have got a truck that is going to be scrap donored, whatever the deal is, if you can just simply cut it right behind where the radius arms is for the frame and take the frame forwards with everything on it, that's the way to go about this. Because you can use the Super Duty mounts, the Super Duty radius arms. If you've got a 4-wheel drive, you will need the coil buckets. If you've got a 2-wheel drive, I use the 2-wheel drive coil buckets. All that's up to you. I use the Super Duty track bar, and then I also use the Super Duty steering gear. Now my swap is a little bit different than what most people are doing. I was trying to keep this truck basically as low as I can to be able to go as fast as I can. And as such, we ended up using basically all the original OBS suspension on this thing. This was originally a 2-wheel drive truck, and we swapped the Duramax into it, which is why we had to convert to the solid axle. So for the Duramax, we had to notch the cross member right there to be able to clear our oil pan. That's where the factory radius arms for the OBS would mount, and that wasn't going to work. So we swapped in the full Dana 60, and it uses basically everything off of the Super Duty. So for your radius arm mounts, you will have to undo all of these rivets that mount it to the original frame, and then you can simply just bolt it in. You will take the whole radius arm bracket and you will just bump it up against the body mount right there. So you go right until it touches that front body mount, and that's how you know that this is in line to be able to center this wheel in the wheel well. Now I know that this wheel doesn't look centered in this, and that is because I have the 08 and plus Super Duty front bumper on this thing. You can see nice radius and everything, and then once you get to the Super Duty bumper, it just kind of knife edges down. Whereas if we had the OBS bumper on here, it would have that curved radius to it to be able to match the body line. Like what that right there is. See how it's nice and rolled? Whereas that one, as you can see, is just boop flat. So radius arms touch the body mounts. Same thing on the driver's side. Radius arms touch the body mount right there. Some people are going to say that you need to reinforce the radius arm mount. Some people say that you don't. I say that you don't because the frame that you are mounting it to is just C-channel. It's not like any specific frame. So whenever you mount the Super Duty radius arms onto there, it'll just bolt right on. So you can see the outside of our radius arm, and then the inside of it is still just like the original setup. Just like it comes off of the Super Duty. You'll have to re-drill all those holes. They line up. You simply, like I've been saying, just bump it up against the body mounts and then you'll be golden. This works for any OBS, whether it's a 150, 250, 350, and for the OBS Broncos. So the body mount is the same location, which will center it into the fender. Now with the radius arms figured out, mounted onto the truck, you will go on to setting your track bar to be able to center the axle into the actual center of where the truck sits at. So I use the factory Super Duty track bar that mounts up over there on the axle, and then over here on this side you can see we simply just mounted it up and onto the frame. There's like a locating dowel pin. You're going to knock that dowel pin out, and then you're going to put a bolt in there, and that's what locates the track bar. And then I made some shims to be able to weld onto the lower section of the engine cradle right there onto the engine cradle, and then mounted the track bar brace onto those pads. You don't have to weld the shims in place. I just did it to be able to hold them in place. You can use like washers or another bolt behind the bolt between the undercarriage, that subframe thing that they've got, and then for where the actual track bar mounts is. If you try to bolt it directly onto that engine cradle thing, it'll be crooked and it won't work. So pro tip. Now you can use the factory OBS steering gear and part of the steering linkage, but that steering gear is pretty weak, and so is the factory linkage. So you'll be able to take that tie rod off and then be able to put the Super Duty tie rod on there. Like I said though, if you're doing the swap, the best thing you can do is just cut it right there behind where the radius arm mounts are and take that whole frame forward section, because you end up with a steering gear, you end up with the track bar mount, you end up with the shocks, you end up with 110% of everything that you can need. If you're just at a yard pulling it, you can pull the steering gear as well. Swapping to the Super Duty steering gear is pretty simple. You will have to drill out these outside bolts. So these 3 bolts out here, you'll have to drill out to be able to get the bigger Super Duty bolts in. And then the Super Duty steering gear bolts right in place. As for the steering shaft, we have got the factory OBS steering shaft sitting in there, and then we welded the Super Duty shaft to the OBS shaft to be able to connect the steering wheel from in the cab to the steering gear. And then this has got, well, a Duramax in it, so we have got the Duramax power steering pump with the Duramax Hydro Boost, and then the Duramax Hydro Boost line runs down over into the steering gear. Now what you'll end up be doing on your OBS, I don't know if you convert to Hydro Boost or whatever it is, but you'll be able to kind of figure out that whole debacle whenever you get into it. Just figure out what lines you're gonna need. As for the spring perches, I've seen different things. I have got the OBS spring mounted up on the axle, and then the OBS spring perch in here. I'll have to get my retaining clip to hold the spring in place. And then you have got where the Super Duty shock mounts to the Super Duty axle, and then it mounts up into the stock OBS spring perch. Now the Super Duty springs are about 6 inches taller, so if you use the Super Duty spring with the OBS bucket, you'll end up with basically a 6-inch lift. That's the Super Duty spring, and then if you really want to get ballsy with it, you can put a 6-inch lift kit onto there. That's what a 6-inch lift spring will look like. And then that'll end up getting you like a 12-inch lift with the OBS buckets. If you use the Super Duty buckets, say you've got a 4-wheel drive OBS with the leaf springs and you're going to the coil spring front end, the Super Duty buckets sit up higher for the spring. So it ends up being like a 2 to 3-inch lift if you use the Super Duty buckets. However, this was an 2-wheel drive pickup truck, and I just used those buckets because they get this thing sitting basically where I want it to sit at. Now I've just got the Super Duty front axle on this. We're still running the OBS rear axle. And from the tire to the fender, we're sitting at just under 5 inches. And then in the rear, we are sitting at, from the tire to the fender, oh geez, right at about 6 inches. Now one thing to note about the overall height on this particular truck is I've got a ton of crap still sitting in the bed. I mean, I have got part of an Allison transmission sitting in here. I've got a diesel fuel tank sitting in here. We've got a couple different turbos sitting in here. We've got just all kinds of crap sitting in the bed of this thing. So we've got quite a few 100 pounds in the back of it. And then we still have got to finish the engine side of it. So we don't have a battery sitting in here right now. Our water to air intercooler isn't hooked up. There is absolutely no coolant sitting in this engine. All of our charge piping isn't done. I'd say that the front end of this is probably going to drop about another half an inch in the front of it. And then we'll probably pick up another, maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches out of the back of it once we get rid of all of this crap. But that's just part of my goal with trying to keep the front of this truck as low as I could keep it for drag racing purposes. I mean, if we were just going for simply a show truck, we'd order a 6-inch lift for a Super Duty, and then this thing would be sitting sky high. Now the rear end of this thing is the factory axle with a drum and a spacer to go out to the Super Duty wheels. That was able to get the offset roughly in line because the Super Duty axle is like 6 inches wider than what the OBS axle is, so be aware that it's a wide axle. Now I did use the Super Duty steering stabilizer. It simply mounts onto the drag link in the factory location, and then I just have a bracket on the frame from the Super Duty into the OBS. That way we're able to avoid the death wobble in this thing. And I think the only other thing to note is that I redid where the brake lines for this thing run. If you've got your factory OBS brake lines, they'll still go there and they will work with the Super Duty deal. However, I have got the Duramax brake booster and the Duramax master cylinder, so it's completely different than what the OBS stuff was. So between changing out the master and changing out the axle, for me it was just easier to redo the entire brake lines. But all in all, it's a very simple swap. It'll take you probably about 2 to 3 weekends of working on it to be able to get all of this stuff figured out right, be able to strip it off of the old frame, put it onto this frame. With this truck in particular, with it sitting as low as it is and those radius arms being kind of angled up a little bit, the caster is a little bit odd on the front end of this thing, so I need to go to a 4-link. But I mean, for right now, it is running and driving just fine. It's steering, it works, and it'll get you by for an afternoon. So hopefully that'll get you all a better idea as to what you need to be able to put an 05 and up Super Duty front axle into your OBS Ford. There's no fancy kit in here. There's no fancy anything. This is literally strip parts off of a Super Duty, bolted onto my OBS. Here it is, it works, and it all lines up like it should. I would like to note that this truck in particular was already a 2-wheel drive truck, so it already had the spring bucket sitting in there, and there wasn't really a whole lot to do to be able to swap in that 05 and up Super Duty axle. Now, if you have got a 4-wheel drive with the twin traction beam thing that happens in front of these, I would be looking for your 99 to 04 Super Duty axles, because that's a solid axle still that uses the leaf spring mounts. So you're able to use the one of those Super Duty axles if it was a 4-wheel drive truck. This is just simpler for my application. Plus, like I said, with going to a 4-link later, this should work pretty good for my application. If you're Looking to make a really big truck, this would also be a pretty good way to do it, because then you're going to be able to get a stupid amount of lift compared to the leaf spring deal. And then if you just want to have a solid axle and get rid of that twin traction beam, 99 to 04 would be my move. That way it maintains basically the same leaf spring mounts, the track bar, the steering gear, all that crap can stay in the truck, and you just swap in that 99 to 04 axle. Just a little side note there. If you got questions or concerns, leave them in the comments. I'm more than happy to answer anything. And then later on, we'll switch to either a AAM 14 bolt, or we'll put a true Super Duty axle into the back of it. It's a pretty straightforward swap. I've just not really sure about what rear axle I want to use with the power I'm making. Obviously, the Duramax makes a little bit more torque and horsepower than what the old 7.3 does. So we're still working through a good bit of stuff.